had been looking forward to a peaceful week away from the chaos of the city. So when I found a quaint mountain cabin in Colorado, on a vacation rental site, it seemed perfect, nestled in a dense pine forest with a serene lake nearby. It was exactly what I needed for a retreat, filled with quiet contemplation and nature walks. Upon my arrival, I was greeted by Earl, the cabin's caretaker. He was a warm elderly man who lived in a smaller house at the base of the hill. After handing me the keys, Earl shared some advice on the best hiking trails and fishing spots. However, as he turned to leave, his demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "Just so you know," Earl began, hesitating a bit, "there have been some reports of bears in the area, and some folks have mentioned seeing figures around the woods at night. Probably just shadows or maybe hikers passing through. But just keep the doors locked and stay safe." I thanked him, slightly amused by his warnings. The first day was blissful. I hiked, took photos of the wildlife, and enjoyed roasting marshmallows over a fire pit. Yet, as night fell, an unnerving feeling crept over me. I spotted figures standing on the cliffs above the cabin, silhouetted against the sky, disappearing whenever I tried to look directly at them. That evening, as I settled into bed, the wind began to howl, and the branches of the pine trees thudded against the windows. I drifted into a restless sleep, only to be awakened around midnight by a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first I thought I was imagining it, the sound blending with the wind. But as I lay there, wide awake, the tapping grew more persistent. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I tiptoed across the room to peer through the window. The moonlight illuminated the forest, but everything seemed normal. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees. It was too large to be a deer, too nimble to be a bear. My heart raced as I watched, frozen, the shadow moving closer to the cabin. Then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. I strained my ears, listening hard, when the shadow reappeared, this time much closer. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone, or something, was out there, watching the cabin, determined to understand what was lurking outside. I forced myself to stay calm. The tapping had ceased, but the presence of someone, or something near the cabin was unmistakable. As I debated my next steps, I realized my first priority was safety. With shaking hands, I checked the locks on the windows and doors again, ensuring they were secure. The wind seemed to carry whispers with it, and I could hear footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the back door. They were soft, cautious, too deliberate to be just a lost hiker. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs as I moved away from the window, seeking the relative safety of deeper inside the cabin. I didn't feel like I was alone anymore. The idea of being watched had solidified into a cold, hard fact. The isolation of the cabin, once so appealing, now felt like a trap. I needed to call for help, but when I checked my phone, the signal was frustratingly weak, a single bar that flickered in and out of existence. As I was trying to send out a text message, the soft, rhythmic tapping resumed. This time it was on the glass of the back door. I froze, my eyes locked on the shadowy outline of a figure through the frosted glass. The tapping grew more insistent, turning into a quiet, yet firm knocking. Gathering the last shreds of my courage, I approached the door, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" The answer came back in a raspy whisper, chilling in its clarity. "Just a friend. Let me in. It's cold out here." The way the voice coaxed sent shivers down my spine. This was no friend. The menacing undertone was unmistakable. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The cabin suddenly felt unbearably small, a flimsy barrier between me and whatever intentions waited outside. I remembered Earl's advice about bears and hikers, but this was no bear, and no hiker would be knocking at my door in the middle of the night. Not like this. I needed to leave, but the thought of stepping outside, where shadows turned into threats, was paralyzing. The knocking grew louder, more demanding. In a moment of desperation, I shouted, "I'm calling the police right now." The knocking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Just when I thought it was over, I heard one last sound, a soft mocking laugh, drifting in through the tiny gap under the door. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck, exhausted from a night spent in terror. I packed my things as the first light filtered through the trees, the beauty of the sunrise doing little to ease my fear. I left the cabin in the early morning light, driving away without looking back, the haunting memory of that laugh echoing in my mind. I reported everything to the local police, but they found no evidence of anyone around the cabin. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the night's events had been a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I heard, what I felt. I knew it was real, and I knew I would never feel safe there again. From then on, every shadow held a threat, every knock on the door a potential horror. The experience at the cabin had changed something fundamental in me. The world was darker than I had ever imagined, and some places, some shadows, are best left unexplored. When I stumbled upon the listing for a hidden resort in the remote stretches of the Adirondacks, it seemed almost too good to be true. The resort promised a unique blend of untouched wilderness and rustic luxury, perfect for my escape from the relentless pressure of city life. The photos showed charming log cabins by a glassy lake, nestled among dense forests that turned fiery with autumn colors. I booked a week-long stay without hesitation. Driving up the winding forest road to the resort, I felt my stresses melt away, replaced by an excited anticipation. The air was crisp, with that sweet earthy scent of pine and damp earth. It was exactly the retreat I had envisioned. However, the reality that greeted me was far from the idyllic paradise advertised. The resort, although undoubtedly beautiful, wore a cloak of unsettling neglect. The reception area was deserted when I arrived, with only a flickering light to greet me, and an old-fashioned key left on the counter with a note. Cabin 12. Enjoy your stay. Management. I drove further into the compound, the gravel crunching under my tires, breaking the profound silence. Cabin 12 was on the far end of the lake, isolated and shadowed by towering pines. Though initially charmed by the solitude, a sense of unease crept over me as I unpacked my things. The cabin was well kept inside, but there were layers of dust, as if no one had visited in a long time. That night, after a quiet dinner alone on the porch, I decided to explore the grounds before sunset. The beauty of the lake at dusk was undeniable, but the quiet was oppressive, almost too heavy. It was then I noticed how truly silent it was. No birds, not even the chirping of crickets. The silence was total, unnatural. As darkness fell, I felt watched. Shadows seemed to move just at the periphery of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. Feeling unnerved, I hurried back to the cabin, where I locked the doors and settled in for the night. Lying in bed, I tried to convince myself that the day's travel was to blame for my anxiety. But as I drifted towards sleep, the sound of footsteps on the porch jolted me awake. They were slow, deliberate, heavy with intent. My heart raced as I lay frozen, listening as they moved back and forth outside. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped. Silence reigned again, a silence so deep it buzzed in my ears. I dared not move, nor did I dare to look outside. I felt trapped, as if the cabin itself held its breath. The next morning, under the light of day, my fears from the night before seemed exaggerated. Embarrassed by my own reactions, I decided to take a walk around the lake to clear my head. The fresh morning air did me good, and slowly, the terror of the night melted away under the warm sun. Refreshed by the walk, I decided to visit the resort's main lodge, in hopes of learning more about the area, and perhaps meeting some staff or other guests. The lodge, a large log building with grand windows, sat overlooking the lake, its surface still and mirror-like under the noon sun. However, as I approached, the same unsettling silence pervaded the air. The lodge, much like the reception, appeared deserted. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the creak echoing ominously through what should have been a bustling hub of activity. Inside, the lodge was beautifully preserved with vintage furnishings and a large stone fireplace, yet no fire crackled, and no voices filled the space. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and old newspapers lay scattered on coffee tables, their headlines fading, feeling more like an intruder than a guest. I wandered through the empty lodge, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. It was then that I noticed a wall of photos, chronicling the history of the resort. The pictures dated back to the early 1900s, showing smiling families, lavish parties, and happy holidaymakers. But as the years progressed, the photos grew fewer, and the gathering smaller. The most recent photo was from several years ago, and it struck me how joy seemed to have leached out of the images over time. Curious and uneasy, I continued my exploration, eventually coming across a small, tucked-away office. Papers and folders were strewn across a desk, and a large, old map of the resort hung on the wall, marked with various trails and cabins. One particular cabin, Cabin 12, my cabin, was circled in red ink, with the word "No" scribbled beside it. A chill ran down my spine as I studied the map, the isolation of Cabin 12 suddenly seeming intentional. I decided to look through the papers, hoping for some explanation, and found a series of increasingly frantic notes from a former manager about disturbances, guest complaints of strange noises at night, and a refusal by staff to work after sunset. The last entry was a resignation letter, the handwriting shaky. Hearing a sound behind me, I spun around, papers clutched in hand, but there was nothing, only the echo of my own movements in the empty lodge. Deciding I had seen enough, I hurried back to my cabin, the day's bright light doing little to dispel the dread growing inside me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, my decision was made. I couldn't stay another night. I began packing my things, the earlier resolve to stay and enjoy the peace of the wilderness, completely forgotten. But as I zipped up my suitcase, the footsteps on the porch began again. This time, they were accompanied by a low humming, a tune that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. Frozen, I listened as the humming grew louder. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and then, a soft knock. "Won't you come out?" A voice crooned sweetly menacing. The door handle rattled gently, as if someone was trying to coax it open. Without thinking, I grabbed my suitcase and opened the back window, the same way I had planned to escape if necessary. Clambering out, I ran through the darkening woods towards my car, parked at the front of the cabin, not daring to look back. I drove away from the forgotten resort, the rearview mirror reflecting nothing but the enveloping darkness of the forest that had seemed so inviting just days before. As I reached the main road, the humming and the footsteps still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the secrets hidden in the silent, watching woods. I booked a week-long stay at a guest house in northern Vermont. After burning out from my desk job, it was the kind of retreat people romanticize. A remote village, thick pine woods, one main road, and a quiet little guest house on the outskirts that looked charming in the photos. The listing promised total solitude and privacy. That's exactly what I thought I needed. The host, a middle-aged man named Ruben, was polite but strange. He greeted me out front, shaking my hand with a firm grip, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He wore a heavy flannel shirt, even though it was warm, and he spoke slowly, like every word needed to be measured. "The other cabins are empty this week," he told me, handing over the key. "You'll have the whole place to yourself. Just don't wander too far off the trails." That last part stuck with me. It sounded more like a warning than advice. I nodded, brushing it off. The guest house itself was small but cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a modest bed, and a screened-in porch that overlooked a gravel path winding into the woods. The quiet was unlike anything I was used to. No traffic, no sirens, not even birdsong, just wind through trees and the occasional groan of old wood. The first 2 days were uneventful. I read books, hiked the nearby trails, and sat in silence, just letting my brain slow down. It was peaceful, though I started to notice that Ruben's truck was always parked near the entrance, even late at night. I never saw him come or go, and every time I returned from a hike, something in the cabin had been moved slightly. A cup turned around, the fridge door not fully shut, the bathroom light left on, when I knew I'd turned it off. On the third night, things shifted. It was around 10 p.m. And I was sitting on the porch drinking tea when I saw movement on the gravel path. At first I thought it was Ruben doing rounds, or maybe checking on something, but whoever it was didn't carry a flashlight. The figure just stood there, about 20 feet away, half hidden behind a tree. I called out, "Hey, can I help you?" No response, just silence, and then the figure slowly backed into the woods. I stood up, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. I told myself it was probably just Ruben being weird, maybe checking on guests in his own creepy way. But something about that moment, how still the person was, how deliberate the retreat was, made it feel wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I left the lights on and kept the curtains closed. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The next morning, I walked to Ruben's house to ask him about it. His place was about 200 yards down the gravel road. A squat A-frame with faded siding, and one of those old wind chimes that clanged in the breeze. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. That's when I noticed his dog bowl on the porch, bone dry, and the trash bin hadn't been emptied in days. It looked like no one had been home in a while, even though his truck was still parked out front. I backed off and returned to my guest house, every instinct in my body screaming that something wasn't right. I tried to convince myself that maybe Ruben had gone out of town unexpectedly, left his truck behind, and asked someone to check in for him. But none of that explained the figure I saw, or why things in my cabin kept being moved around. That afternoon, I stayed indoors. I didn't go hiking, didn't sit out on the porch. I kept my phone close, though there was barely any reception, and every time I glanced at the single bar of signal, I debated whether to call someone, anyone. Around 6 p.m., I heard something not loud, just off, a faint scraping sound, like wood being dragged across the floor. I froze. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the little pantry closet. I grabbed the fireplace poker and approached slowly, my bare feet making no noise on the old wooden floor. I listened, held my breath, and then swung the pantry door open. Nothing, but the smell hit me. Damp clothes, sweat, earth. I looked down. There were boot prints on the floor. Not mine. I backed up and locked the door immediately. My first thought was to pack up and drive to the nearest town. I threw clothes into my bag and grabbed my keys from the nightstand, only to realize they weren't there. I searched the table, the floor, my backpack, the kitchen. Nothing. The keys were gone. I felt it in my chest first, like my heart had suddenly dropped into my stomach. Someone had been inside, not just moving things, not just watching. Inside, I moved to the front door, to run and find help. When I opened it, there was something sitting on the top step, a small metal object, my keys, just sitting there, like someone wanted me to know they'd taken them, wanted me to see how close they had been, maybe still were. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Every window, every entrance, I checked them all. Then I turned off the lights and crouched in the hallway, the poker still in my hand. I stayed that way for almost 2 hours, listening for any creak, any footstep. I don't think I blinked the whole time. Eventually I heard something outside. Not footsteps, breathing. Someone was standing just outside the living room window, the one by the couch. I could hear the faint exhale and inhale, slow and steady. They weren't trying to hide it. I didn't look. I didn't move. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. That breathing stayed there for 5 full minutes. Then nothing. I waited another 20 before I dared to get up. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light off and sat in the dark with the poker across my lap, watching the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. The next morning, I packed what I could and got out the second the sun was up. My keys worked fine. Ruben's truck was still there, but his house was as lifeless as it had been the day before. I didn't see another person until I made it to a gas station 30 miles away. I reported everything to the sheriff's office in the nearest town. They nodded and took notes, but I could tell this wasn't the first time someone had come in shaken from that place. They said they'd look into it, I never heard from them again. Sometimes, I still wonder if Ruben ever existed, if the man I met that day was really the owner, or if he was just part of the act, something to make people feel safe before they were left alone in that quiet, watching place. All I know is, whatever was out there wasn't trying to rob me. It wasn't even trying to hurt me. It was playing with me. And if I hadn't left when I did, I'm not sure I'd be around to tell you this story.